In May 1915, as the great powers of Europe bled themselves white in the trenches of France and the fields of Poland, a new front was about to open in the most unlikely of battlefields, the pristine vertical world of the Alps. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, a nation fighting for its very survival against Russia and Serbia, now faced a new threat. Italy, their former ally in the Triple Alliance, had declared war. At the imperial headquarters in Vienna, the mood was not one of panic, but of cold, aristocratic fury and profound contempt. The chief of the General Staff, Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf, was the embodiment of this sentiment. A hawkish, aggressive strategist, he had long viewed Italy with suspicion and disdain. He saw Italy's declaration of war not as a noble act, but as a treacherous betrayal, a scavenger's stab in the back. This contempt was not just political, it was military. Conrad and his staff viewed the Royal Italian Army as a second-rate force, a joke compared to their own professional, battle-hardened KUK, Kaiserliche und Königliche Army. They saw the Italians as possessing great flair and romanticism, but lacking the grim, disciplined professionalism required for modern industrial warfare. The Italian army was large on paper, a mass of over 1 million conscripts. But the Austro-Hungarian intelligence reports were clear. It was poorly equipped, badly led, and critically deficient in modern artillery and machine guns. Conrad believed the Italians would be no match for his veteran troops, who had been fighting the Russians for nearly a year. He expected a swift, humiliating defeat for the turncoat nation. But the greatest source of Conrad's confidence was not his army, but the battlefield itself. The border between Austria-Hungary and Italy was a fortress forged by God. It was a jagged, 400-mile line of soaring Alpine peaks, sheer rock faces, and treacherous glaciers. This was not a front for grand maneuvers. It was a vertical wall of stone and ice. The Austro-Hungarians held a massive strategic advantage. Their side of the border dominated the mountains, giving them the high ground almost everywhere. They controlled the key passes, the mountain peaks, and the strategic valleys. Any Italian attack would have to be a desperate, uphill struggle against an enemy looking down on them from impregnable positions. Conrad's plan was simple and, in his view, infallible. It was a strategy of active defense. He would not contest every meter of the border. Instead, he would withdraw his forces to a series of carefully prepared, high-altitude fortifications. He would let the Italian army exhaust itself, bleeding to death in futile assaults against his mountain fortresses. The Alps themselves would be his primary weapon. The Austro-Hungarian army had its own elite mountain troops, the Kaiserjäger and the Kaiserschützen. These were men born in the mountains of Tyrol and Carinthia, expert climbers and skiers, imbued with a fierce local pride. They looked upon their Italian counterparts, the Alpini, with derision, seeing them as pale imitations of their own authentic Alpine warrior culture. The Austro-Hungarian generals believed the very nature of mountain warfare made a successful offensive impossible. The thin air, the extreme cold, the constant threat of avalanches, and the logistical nightmare of supplying troops at 10,000 feet were problems they believed could not be solved on a large scale. They were masters of this environment and were certain no one else could be. The Italian commander, General Luigi Cadorna, was, in the Austrian view, a confirmation of their intellectual superiority. Cadorna was a rigid, old-school disciplinarian, a firm believer in the frontal assault and the power of willpower. The Austrians knew he would throw his men in costly, unimaginative wave attacks against their mountain strongholds. They were counting on his predictability. This arrogance was based on a century of military tradition. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, for all its internal fractures, possessed one of the oldest and proudest officer corps in Europe. They saw themselves as the guardians of a noble military science, and they looked down on the newer, less pedigreed Italian army as amateurs. The problem the Italians faced seemed, from Vienna, utterly insurmountable. To achieve any success, they would have to advance up sheer mountain faces under the plunging fire of an enemy dug into rock and ice, all while trying to build roads and haul supplies through a landscape that was hostile to human life itself. It was a tactical nightmare of the highest order. The Austrians had spent years fortifying this border. They had constructed a network of high-altitude forts, concrete bunkers, and artillery positions hewn from the living rock. This was their impenetrable wall, and they had absolute faith in its ability to hold back any Italian assault. This confidence was so great that Conrad actually stripped the Italian front of many of his best troops to send them to the more critical fight against Russia on the Eastern Front. He left behind a relatively thin screen of reservists, older men, and the elite Kaiserjäger, confident that they and the mountains would be more than enough. The Austro-Hungarian view of the Italian soldier was a caricature of national stereotypes. They saw them as loud, undisciplined, and quick to surrender, lacking the stoic, grim determination of their own multi-ethnic troops. This cultural disdain blinded them to the unique qualities the Italians were about to bring to the fight. The world itself seemed to mock the Italian endeavor. Military observers from other nations, including their own allies, were deeply skeptical. The White War, as it came to be known, seemed like a strategic sideshow, a pointless and impossible struggle in the clouds, far from the decisive battlefields of France. Conrad's plan was not just to defend, it was to humiliate. He intended to let Italy break itself against the mountains for a year, and then, once Russia was dealt with, he would launch his own punitive offensive from the Trentino, a Strafe expedition, to punish Italy for its betrayal and knock it out of the war. The logistical challenges alone were considered a barrier to any serious Italian offensive. Every bullet, every loaf of bread, every piece of timber for a dugout would have to be hauled up thousands of feet by men or on the backs of mules, often along narrow, exposed mountain paths. The Austro-Hungarians believed the Italian army would collapse under its own logistical weight. They failed to appreciate the nature of their new enemy. The Italian army was not just an army, it was a nation. The fight to reclaim the unredeemed Italian-speaking lands of Trentino and Trieste was a cause of immense nationalistic fervor. The Italians were not just fighting a war, they were fighting a crusade for unification. The Austro-Hungarian generals were experts in a known form of mountain warfare, the defense of passes and valleys. They could not conceive of a new form of war. A war fought on the peaks themselves, a war of miners and engineers, a three-dimensional battle fought both on the surface and deep within the mountains. This intellectual rigidity was their greatest weakness. They had prepared for the war they expected to fight, a war where their superior positions and professional soldiers would easily repulse waves of poorly led Italian infantry. They were unprepared for an enemy that would refuse to play by these rules. They particularly underestimated the Alpini. While the Austrians saw their own Kaiserjäger as the true masters of the Alps, they viewed the Alpini as little more than peasant infantry who happened to come from the mountains. They did not understand the Alpini's deep, almost spiritual connection to the terrain and their incredible skills in mountaineering. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a mosaic of different ethnicities: Germans, Hungarians, Slavs, and others. This was a source of strength, but also of internal friction. They looked at the more homogeneous Italian army and failed to see the powerful unifying force of its shared language and nationalistic goals. In the weeks leading up to the first Italian attacks, the mood in the Austrian mountain forts was relaxed. The soldiers reinforced their positions, enjoyed the stunning Alpine views, and wrote letters home, confident that they were in the safest, most impregnable sector of the entire World War. The problem the Italians faced was not just military. It was a war against gravity, against the weather, and against geology itself. The Austrians believed that these forces of nature were their greatest allies, allies that could not be defeated by mere human courage or numbers. General Cadorna's initial strategy confirmed all of the Austrian biases. He launched the first of what would become 11 bloody battles of the Isonzo, a series of frontal assaults in the eastern, lower-lying sector of the front. These attacks were costly failures that seemed to prove the Austrians' contempt for Italian military skill was entirely justified. But while the world watched the carnage on the Isonzo, a different, stranger war was beginning to take shape further west, high up in the Dolomites and the Adamello glaciers. It was a war that was not being directed by Cadorna, but was evolving organically, driven by the unique skills of Italy's mountain troops. The Austro-Hungarian leadership, focused on the great battles on the Isonzo, paid little attention to these high-altitude skirmishes. They were seen as minor, localized actions, irrelevant to the main strategic picture. They failed to see that this was where the new, hellish form of warfare was being born. Their arrogance was complete. They were the masters of the mountains. They held the high ground. Their army was superior. Their enemy was incompetent. The laws of nature and warfare were on their side. Every piece of available evidence seemed to confirm their worldview. And so, as the first Italian mountain troops, the Alpini, began their lonely, perilous ascent up the sheer rock faces, the Austrian commanders watched from their fortified peaks with derision. They were watching what they believed to be a futile gesture, an act of romantic but foolish Italian bravado, completely unaware that they were about to face an enemy that would turn their mountain fortress into a vertical tomb. The Austro-Hungarian contempt for the Italian army was for the most part justified, but they failed to make a critical distinction. The Italian army was not one homogeneous force. It contained within it a secret weapon, an elite corps of men who were not just soldiers, but a warrior tribe born from the very mountains the Austrians believed were their exclusive domain. They were the Alpini. The Alpini were not a new or hastily assembled unit. They had been founded in 1872 with one specific prophetic purpose: to defend the mountainous northern borders of Italy. For over 40 years, they had been training for this exact war in this exact terrain. Their entire existence was predicated on the strategic reality of Alpine combat. Their strength came from a unique recruiting system. Unlike other regiments, the Alpini recruited their men only from the small, hardy communities of the Italian Alps. They were farmers, shepherds, and lumberjacks who had grown up in the high valleys, who knew the mountains intimately, and who possessed a natural resilience to the thin air and extreme cold. An Alpino was instantly recognizable by his iconic felt hat, the Cappello Alpino, adorned with a single black raven's feather, La Penna Nera. This feather was not mere decoration. It was a symbol of their elite status, a mark of pride that connected them to the eagles of their mountain home and set them apart from all other soldiers. Their training was unlike any other in the world. While regular infantry drilled on parade squares, the Alpini practiced rock climbing on sheer cliffs, traversed treacherous glaciers, and learned to ski with heavy packs and rifle. They were not just soldiers trained to be mountaineers. They were expert mountaineers trained to be soldiers. They were, in essence, human mules. Their physical endurance was legendary. They were trained to carry crushing loads, machine guns, ammunition, heavy mortars, up thousands of feet of vertical, unforgiving terrain. In a war where no vehicle could go, the Alpini became their own logistical network, their legs the engine of the entire mountain front. For the Austro-Hungarian soldier, often a conscript from the flat plains of Hungary or Bohemia, the Alps were a terrifying and alien obstacle. For the Alpino, they were home. He knew the secret goat tracks. He could read the changing weather in the clouds. He understood the moods of the rock and the ice. The mountain was not his enemy, it was his greatest ally. Yet even within the Italian high command, the true potential of the Alpini was not fully grasped. General Cadorna, with his rigid focus on massed infantry assaults on the Isonzo River, often saw the Alpini as a peripheral force, useful for guarding flanks, but not for decisive action. He would soon be proven catastrophically wrong. For an Alpino, the primary enemy was often not the soldier in the opposing trench, but the mountain itself. The greatest killer on this front was the Morte Bianca, the White Death. Avalanches, whether natural or deliberately triggered by artillery, would claim thousands of lives, burying entire barracks and patrols in an instant, silent tomb. While the regular Italian army was chronically under-equipped, the Alpini possessed specialized gear suited for their vertical world. They used light mountain artillery that could be disassembled into several hundred-pound loads for transport by mule or man. They fought with ice axes, crampons and ropes, and were equipped with white snow camouflage that made them phantoms in the winter landscape. A unique culture defined the Alpini. It was a culture of quiet professionalism, fierce loyalty to one's valley and battalion, and a dark, fatalistic humor born from living and fighting at the edge of human endurance. They had their own songs, their own traditions, and a deep-seated pride that was unshakable. Their command structure was built on experience. A young lieutenant, a boccia rookie, fresh from the academy, learned his trade from the veteran sergeants and corporals, the veci, old ones, men who had spent their lives in the mountains and whose practical knowledge was worth more than any military textbook. The Austrian Kaiserjäger were superb soldiers, but they were often employed as elite shock troops in a conventional manner. The Alpini, by necessity, were evolving a new doctrine. It was not a war fought on the mountains, but a war fought with the mountains. They began to see the peaks and glaciers not as obstacles, but as weapons to be wielded. Here, then, was the improbable solution to the Austro-Hungarian fortress. It was not a new siege gun or a revolutionary tactical plan. It was a group of men who could negate the Austrians' greatest advantage, the high ground, by simply climbing higher. They were the one weapon that could turn the fortress against its own masters. The first moves of the Alpini in the summer of 1915 were not grand battles. They were quiet, ghost-like infiltrations. Small patrols would climb impossible rock faces at night, hauling up machine guns and supplies to establish tiny outposts on peaks and ridges that the Austrians had considered inaccessible and had left unguarded. This was the true beginning of the hellish warfare the Austrians would come to dread. It was a war of position, of occupying the highest possible ground. An Italian flag appearing on a previously unconquered summit was a direct challenge, forcing the Austrians to react, to send their own troops up into the same hostile environment to contest the peak. The Alpini were not just climbers, they were incredible high-altitude engineers. They began to carve trenches not in mud, but in solid granite and glacial ice, using drills and dynamite. They built barracks that clung to sheer cliff faces like eagles' nests, creating a new vertical version of the trench warfare that defined the Western Front. To supply these impossible positions, they constructed a breathtaking network of cableways, or teleferiche. These improvised ski lifts, often stretching for miles over deep chasms, became the logistical backbone of the White War. They were the steel arteries that pumped men, food, and ammunition to the highest peaks, keeping the fight alive in the clouds. The initial Austrian reaction was one of disbelief and annoyance. They would see an Italian flag on a peak they thought was theirs, and Conrad would be forced to divert precious troops from the Russian front to deal with these minor incursions. Each peak became a new battle, a new drain on his limited resources. Thus, a new form of stalemate was born, a vertical trench war. All along the front, armies now faced each other from fortified positions carved into the ice, often at altitudes of over 10,000 feet. They were sometimes separated by thousands of feet of vertical rock, yet close enough to shout insults at one another. In this new vertical war, the Alpini's innate advantages became decisive. Their bodies were naturally acclimated to the thin air. Their mountaineering skills allowed them to move faster and more securely across the treacherous terrain. They simply knew how to survive in an environment that was actively trying to kill everyone in it. The true logistical heroes of this front were not men, but animals. Thousands upon thousands of mules were the only vehicles capable of carrying supplies up the winding, shell-swept mountain paths to the cableway stations. The bond between an Alpino and his mule was one of mutual survival. When frontal assaults against these rock-hewn positions proved suicidal, an even more terrible form of warfare was invented: the War of Mines. Both sides began a slow, torturous process of tunneling deep into the mountains, under their enemies' fortifications, to plant massive charges of explosives and literally blow the entire mountaintop and its defenders to pieces. The spirit of the force was embodied in its junior officers. A young Alpino lieutenant was expected to lead from the front, to be the first man on the rope during a climb and the last man to eat. They were given immense autonomy to solve the unique tactical problems of their small, isolated sectors, fostering a culture of incredible innovation. The Italian army was a paradox. As a whole, it was a flawed, unwieldy institution, poorly led at the highest levels, but it contained within it this diamond-hard core of elite specialists, the Alpini, who were arguably the finest mountain troops in the world. The Austrian blind spot was their conventional thinking. Their magnificent mountain fortress was designed to repel an army advancing through the valleys. They had never conceived of an enemy that would ignore the valleys entirely and instead launch an assault directly on the fortress walls themselves. The daily reality of this war was a struggle against the elements. More soldiers on the Italian front would die from avalanches, frostbite, lightning strikes, and disease than from direct enemy action. It was a war where Mother Nature was the most formidable combatant. The initial phase of the White War, the race for the peaks, was ending. The board was set. Both armies were now entrenched in a bizarre high-altitude parody of the Western Front. The stage was set for a new, even more horrifying chapter of this vertical conflict. The Alpini, through their skill and audacity, had challenged the Austrian masters in their own domain. They had proven that the mountains were not an impenetrable barrier, but a battlefield to be conquered. The arrogance of the Austrian command was now being replaced by a grim new reality. With both sides now clinging to the frozen peaks, separated by impossibly steep terrain, the question became, how do you attack? How do you win a war when the battlefield itself is your greatest enemy? The soldiers of the White War would have to invent new, even more terrible ways to kill each other, turning the pristine Alps into a frozen, high-altitude hell. As the brutal winter of 1915 gave way to the spring of 1916, one mountain in the Dolomites had become an obsession for both sides. It was Col di Lana. Its summit, heavily fortified by the Austrian Kaiserjäger, dominated the surrounding valleys, acting as a crucial linchpin in their defensive line. For the Italians, it was a constant mocking symbol of their inability to advance, and they had nicknamed it Col di Sangue, the Hill of Blood. The nickname was well earned. Throughout 1915, General Cadorna had ordered a series of disastrous frontal assaults on the mountain's slopes. Wave after wave of brave Alpini had been sent up the steep, icy inclines, only to be scythed down by the perfectly positioned Austrian machine guns and artillery. The mountain had consumed thousands of Italian lives and had not yielded a single inch. It was in the face of this bloody impossibility that a new, terrible idea was born. An Italian mining engineer, Lieutenant Don Galasio Caetani, proposed a radical solution. If the Alpini could not go over the mountain, he argued, then they would have to go through it. The plan was audacious and almost insane: to tunnel deep into the mountain and obliterate the entire Austrian summit garrison with a massive explosive charge. In secret, the work began. The Alpini were not just soldiers. Many were experienced miners from the mountain villages of Italy. Using pneumatic drills and sheer brute force, they began to carve a tunnel into the solid rock at the base of Col di Lana. It was a slow, agonizing process, a hidden battle waged in darkness, hundreds of feet below the enemy. On the summit, the Austrian defenders began to hear things. At first, it was a faint, intermittent vibration, but soon it became a distinct, terrifying sound, carrying up through the solid rock, the unmistakable tap-tap-tapping of drilling. A cold dread settled over the garrison. They were living in a fortress, but they suddenly realized that the floor of their fortress was being eaten away from beneath them. The Austrian command reacted with predictable efficiency. They dispatched their own engineers to begin a countermine, a tunnel designed to intercept the Italian gallery. A desperate, silent race now began deep within the mountain. It was a subterranean duel, a blind and claustrophobic battle where the first side to miscalculate would be buried alive. For the Austrian Kaiserjäger on the peak, life became a psychological torment. They were still the masters of the mountain, safe from any frontal assault. But now they were living on a volcano. Every moment, every strange sound from below brought the fear that the very ground beneath their feet was about to erupt in a cataclysm of fire and rock. For the Italian miners, the conditions were hellish. They worked in cramped, dark tunnels with a constant lack of oxygen, the air thick with rock dust. The danger of a cave-in was ever present, as was the terrifying possibility of breaking through into the Austrian countermine, leading to a desperate underground firefight. But the Italians won the subterranean race. They reached their target, a point directly beneath the Austrian fortifications. Now began the painstaking task of hauling over 5 metric tons, more than 11,000 pounds, of high explosives into the final chamber. Dozens of Alpini carried the heavy crates of gelatin dynamite through the narrow, twisting tunnels. On the evening of April 17, 1916, all was ready. The detonator wires were laid. Along the slopes below, thousands of Italian assault troops moved silently into position, their faces turned up towards the dark summit. They were not waiting for a whistle. They were waiting for the mountain itself to give the signal to attack. At precisely 11:35 p.m., an Italian engineer in a hidden command post pushed down on the plunger of the detonator. For a few heart-stopping seconds, there was only silence, and then a deep, primal rumble began to emanate from the very bowels of the earth, a sound that was felt more than it was heard. The entire mountain began to groan. Then the summit of Col di Lana ceased to exist. In a deafening, earth-shattering roar, the entire peak erupted in a titanic fireball of orange and red. 10,000 tons of rock, ice and fortifications were blasted into the night sky, creating a man-made volcano in the heart of the Dolomites. The shockwave was felt for miles around. From a nearby Austrian observation post, a young officer watched in absolute horror. He saw the familiar silhouette of the Col di Lana summit, where over 100 of his comrades were stationed, simply vanish from the skyline, replaced by a rising cloud of incandescent dust. It was as if a malevolent god had just taken a bite out of the mountain range. Into this apocalyptic scene of dust, chaos, and falling rock, the waiting Alpini charged. They swarmed up the newly formed slopes, their bayonets fixed, capturing what was left of the position from the few dazed and shell-shocked survivors. Where months of frontal assaults had failed, a single terrible explosion had succeeded. The blast instantly killed approximately 110 Austrian soldiers of the 2nd Tyrolean Kaiserjäger Regiment. They were not just killed, they were entombed. Their bodies were vaporized or buried under thousands of tons of rock, their fortified summit transformed into their final resting place. A new and terrible form of industrial killing had been perfected. The news of Col di Lana's decapitation sent a tremor of shock through the Austro-Hungarian High Command. Their entire defensive strategy was predicated on the invincibility of their mountain fortresses. That assumption was just blown to pieces. The Italians had proven that no position was truly impregnable. If they could not assault it, they would simply annihilate it. This event established a new, horrifying rulebook for the White War. The battle was no longer just for the surface of the mountains. It was a war for the very geology beneath. Every strategic peak on the entire front, Pasubio, Lagazuoi, Marmolada, was now a potential target. No Austrian soldier on any summit could ever feel truly safe again. The war of mines escalated. The years that followed saw both sides engage in a feverish, hidden arms race deep within the Alps. The mountains became honeycombed with tunnels and explosive-filled chambers. It was a slow, patient, and terrifying form of warfare, where battles were fought by engineers over months and decided in a single, cataclysmic second. This was not an isolated incident. In September 1916, the Austrians would retaliate by blowing the summit of nearby Monte Simone, killing over 1,000 Italian soldiers. The hellish warfare pioneered by the Italians at Col di Lana had now become the standard, brutal dialectic of the mountain front. For the soldiers garrisoned on these peaks, the psychological torment was unimaginable. The enemy was no longer just in the trench opposite them. They were below them, in the darkness, digging, always digging. The very ground they slept on was no longer solid. It was a weapon being aimed at their hearts. The heroes of this new war were the miners. Men like Pietro de Togni, an Alpino who spent months drilling in the dark, wrestling with failing equipment and the constant threat of being buried alive. These were the human moles, the silent, unseen soldiers whose slow, patient work decided the fate of the mountains. This new form of combat took on an almost mythical Wagnerian quality. It was a war of titans, of men challenging the gods by reshaping the eternal peaks of the Alps with dynamite and steel. The landscape itself had become a weapon, and the mountains were bleeding. The soundtrack of the White War changed. To the familiar thunder of artillery and the roar of avalanches, a new, more sinister sound was added. The faint, persistent, maddening tap-tap-tapping of drills and pickaxes, a sound that traveled through the rock, a constant reminder of the explosive death that was being prepared below. An Austrian officer's diary from a nearby mountain captured the new reality. We live on the lip of a volcano which the Italians have lit. We can hear them working. We do not know when the eruption will come, only that it will. We are no longer soldiers. We are condemned men, waiting for the mountain to pass its judgment. Even the arch-traditionalist General Cadorna, a man who believed in the power of the bayonet above all else, could not ignore the stunning success at Col di Lana. He was forced to recognize the effectiveness of this new, unconventional form of warfare that his underestimated mountain troops had pioneered. This was the shocking turning point. The Austro-Hungarian generals had mocked the Italians' ability to fight a conventional war, and they were largely right. But they were now confronted by a form of warfare so unconventional, so surreal, so hellish, that it seemed to belong to a different dimension, a dimension they were completely unprepared for. The Alpini had not just fought on the mountain. They had turned the mountain into a weapon. They had used its own geology against its defenders. This was a strategic and intellectual leap that the Austrian command had never conceived of. They had prepared for an assault, not a geological execution. Frontal assaults against these high-altitude fortresses were suicidal. Artillery was often inaccurate and ineffective against positions hewn from solid rock. The mine was the only answer. It was a terrible, slow-moving, but ultimately unstoppable key to this vertical Alpine lock. Nothing on this scale had ever been seen in the history of warfare. Armies had tunneled under fortress walls for centuries, but never before had entire mountaintops been packed with explosives and detonated, fundamentally and permanently altering the geography of the battlefield itself. The detonation at Col di Lana had revealed the new, terrifying face of the White War. The Austrian generals now knew their mountain fortresses were not castles, but potential tombs. But what was the strange science behind this new vertical and subterranean war? How did men even survive, let alone fight and supply themselves in this three-dimensional hellscape? The hellish warfare of the Italian front was not chaos. It was a new and terrible science. The core strategic genius of the Alpini was to recognize that this was a three-dimensional battlefield. Victory would be achieved not just by moving forward, but by moving up, and when necessary, by moving through the very rock itself. They were fighting a war of horizontal, vertical, and subterranean control simultaneously. The single most important piece of technology in this new war was not a gun, but the humble cableway, the teleferica. These were the steel arteries of the White War. Miles upon miles of steel cable were strung across immense chasms and up sheer cliff faces. On these, men, food, ammunition, and even the wounded were transported to positions that were otherwise completely cut off from the world. Without them, the war in the clouds would have been impossible. Survival at 10,000 feet required incredible feats of high-altitude engineering. The Alpini and the Austrians became masters of construction in an impossible environment. They built entire villages of wooden barracks that clung precariously to sheer rock faces. They carved trench systems not out of earth, but out of solid glacial ice, and blasted roads onto cliff edges where only eagles had previously dared to tread. The War of Mines was a slow, patient, and highly technical science. It was a battle of geology and engineering. Teams used pneumatic drills, powered by distant compressors, to bite into the rock. They faced the constant challenges of tunnel ventilation, removing rubble, and making complex geometric calculations to ensure their explosive chamber would be in the perfect position, directly beneath the enemy's strongest point. The weaponry of the White War was highly specialized. The true king of the battlefield was the light, portable mountain gun, like the Italian 65mm. These cannons could be disassembled into multiple smaller loads, allowing them to be hauled up the mountains by mules or men and reassembled on the highest peaks to provide crucial fire support. Mortars and hand grenades were also essential for this vertical trench warfare. The environment itself became a weapon. Both sides became grim masters of the White Death. 2. Artillery observers learned to fire shells, not at the enemy's trench, but into the vast, unstable snowfields hanging hundreds of feet above their positions. The resulting man-made avalanches were a terrifyingly effective weapon, capable of silently wiping out an entire company in seconds. The Austro-Hungarians' primary strategic advantage remained the high ground. From their fortified peaks, a single, well-placed Schwarzlose machine gun could dominate an entire valley approach, making a conventional assault suicidal. Their artillery observers, perched on the highest summits, had a god's-eye view of the Italian lines, able to direct fire with pinpoint devastating accuracy. The Italian counter-strategy was audacious. Since they could not take the fortified Austrian peaks by frontal assault, the Alpini would instead identify even higher, more difficult, and often unguarded neighboring peaks. They would undertake perilous nighttime climbs to occupy these new positions, forcing the Austrians to react and stretch their already thin lines to defend against this new, elevated threat. This evolved into a desperate war for observation. The side that held the highest summit controlled the battlefield. From that vantage point, they could see every movement, every supply convoy, every troop rotation of the enemy below. A single, well-hidden observer on a mountain peak became more valuable than an entire battalion of infantry in the valley. The sheer physical cost of altitude was immense. At 10,000 feet, the air contains roughly 30% less oxygen than at sea level. This had a brutal effect on the human body. Every action, walking, digging, even breathing, required a monumental effort. Soldiers new to the front were often incapacitated for weeks by severe altitude sickness. The cold was a relentless, invisible enemy. In the winter, temperatures would plummet to 30 degrees C, 22 degrees C, and below. Frostbite was a constant gnawing threat. Metal rifle bolts would freeze solid to a soldier's wet gloves. More men on this front would be evacuated for severe frostbite, a condition that could lead to amputation than for combat wounds. The strategic numbers of the Italian front are staggering. While General Cadorna hurled millions of men into the 11 bloody and largely futile battles of the Isonzo, the White War was fought by a much smaller number of elite specialists. But their strategic importance was immense as they tied down some of the Austro-Hungarian Empire's best troops. Ultimately, the White War was a grinding stalemate, a perfect microcosm of the futility of World War I. The terrain gave an almost insurmountable advantage to the defender. Taking a fortified mountain position was a near impossible task. Holding one against a determined attacker was only slightly less difficult. The lines, carved in rock and ice, barely moved for 3 years. The true logistical backbone of this entire front was the humble mule. Thousands upon thousands of these stubborn, sure-footed animals were the only vehicles capable of navigating the narrow, treacherous, and shell-swept mountain paths. They carried everything from food to artillery pieces, and the bond between an Alpino and his mule was one of deep, mutual respect and survival. Casualty evacuation was a medical nightmare. A soldier wounded on a high peak faced a horrific journey to safety. He might have to be lowered hundreds of feet down a cliff face in a basket stretcher, or sent down a swaying teleferica under enemy fire. Many men died from shock and exposure during the evacuation before their wounds could even be treated. In a stunning feat of engineering, the Austrians constructed a virtual city in the ice inside the Marmolada Glacier. To escape Italian shelling, their engineers carved a labyrinth of tunnels, barracks, and supply depots directly into the glacier itself. It was a surreal, blue-tinged world, protected by millions of tons of ancient ice. The Italians responded with their own marvels of construction. They built entire villages of wooden barracks that clung like barnacles to sheer vertical rock faces. These precarious structures were often connected by rope bridges and walkways suspended over terrifying drops, a testament to the human ability to adapt to even the most hostile environment. The acoustics of the mountains created a strange and terrifying soundscape. A single rifle shot could echo through the valleys for what seemed like minutes. The roar of an avalanche was a sound that struck primal fear into the hearts of all soldiers, a sound that meant the White Death was on the move and there was nowhere to run. Even the simple act of feeding the armies was a daily logistical miracle. Rations often arrived frozen solid and had to be thawed over a precious fire. Wine was a critical component of the daily ration for both sides, providing essential calories and a small measure of warmth and comfort against the crushing cold and misery. The deliberate weaponization of avalanches reached its horrific peak in December 1916. During a period of heavy snowfall, both sides began firing artillery into the snowpack to bury their enemies. On Black Friday, December 13th, a series of massive avalanches, both natural and man-made, swept down the mountains, killing an estimated 10,000 soldiers in a single, horrific day. The subterranean war had its own unique horrors. When an Italian mine and an Austrian countermine intersected deep within a mountain, it would result in a desperate, close-quarters battle fought in absolute darkness with pistols, grenades, and sharpened spades. It was a claustrophobic, primitive form of combat. The White War was its own strategic avalanche. It began with the small crack of a few Alpini patrols occupying high peaks. It quickly escalated into an all-consuming, unstoppable conflict that drew in hundreds of thousands of men and vast resources, a form of total mountain warfare that grew in ferocity until it had reshaped the very landscape. In this strange war, The mountain was the main enemy. Austrian and Italian soldiers were, in a way, united in their shared struggle against gravity, cold, and the ever-present threat of the White Death. A brief, unspoken truce was often observed by both sides in the immediate aftermath of a major avalanche, as they raced to dig out survivors. The strategic value of a single peak could be immense. Mountains like Monte Pasubio became the site of years of ferocious fighting, with both sides tunneling and blowing apart its features. Thousands of lives were spent to gain a few meters of high ground that offered a commanding view of the enemy's supply lines. The contrast with the Western Front was stark. That was a horizontal war, defined by mud, mass infantry, and industrial scale. This was a vertical war, defined by rock, ice, and elite specialists. It was a war of alpinists and engineers, a more intimate, and in some ways, more terrible form of conflict. The doctrine of the White War was not about annihilation, but about position. The primary goal was not to destroy the enemy army in a single decisive battle, as on other fronts. It was to achieve a superior geographical position from which you could slowly, methodically, and inevitably bleed your enemy to death. The strategic genius of the Alpini was their ability to transform a recreational pastime, mountaineering, into a military science. They applied the principles of climbing, risk assessment, rope work, endurance, to achieve military objectives that a conventional army would have deemed impossible. To their credit, the Austrian Kaiserjäger adapted with incredible skill and courage. They were masters of mountain defense, and they turned the peaks they held into fortresses of rock and ice that the Italians would never truly conquer. They met the Italian challenge and created a bloody, grinding stalemate in the clouds. Was it strategically worth it? The immense cost in lives, the Herculean engineering efforts, all for territorial gains that were often measured in meters. The White War is a perfect frozen microcosm of the larger futility of the First World War, a testament to human endurance and stubbornness in the face of impossible odds. We have now seen the unbelievable strategic and engineering feats required to wage this war. We have analyzed the science of avalanches, mines, and vertical logistics, but what was the daily reality for the men who had to live, fight, and die in this frozen, three-dimensional hell? What was the true human cost of this war in the clouds? The White War was a conflict of impossible engineering and audacious strategy, but its true currency was human endurance. The cableways were the arteries and the mines were the fists, but the heart of this entire front was the individual soldier, the man who had to live, fight, and somehow survive in a world actively hostile to his very existence. The Alpino was a man forged by his environment. He was typically quiet, pragmatic, and possessed a grim sense of humor. His loyalties were simple and fierce, to his family, to his valley, and to the small group of men from his village who now formed his squad. He was not fighting for a distant king or a grand ideology. He was defending the edge of his own home. Facing him was the Austro-Hungarian Kaiserjäger. He too was a mountain man, often from the German-speaking Tyrol, fiercely loyal to the centuries-old Habsburg Empire and his emperor, Franz Joseph. He was a proud professional soldier who saw the Italians as treacherous invaders of his homeland. A deep, often bitter rivalry existed between these two elite corps. For these men, the daily reality was not constant combat, but a constant, exhausting struggle for survival. The day was a cycle of back-breaking labor, digging out trenches buried by overnight snow, reinforcing dugout roofs against the crushing weight of ice, and the simple, all-consuming task of trying to stay warm in the face of a relentless, bone-chilling cold. Their homes were primitive wooden huts, barack, that clung to the sides of cliffs or were half buried in the snow for insulation. Inside, they were cramped, dark, and freezing. Men slept huddled together for warmth, their breath turning to frost on their blankets. It was a life of profound hardship and discomfort. Survival in this vertical world depended on specialized gear. The soldiers were clad in layers of thick wool, their boots studded with hobnails for grip on the ice. They wore snow goggles to prevent snow blindness and smeared their faces with grease to ward off frostbite. In winter, they were ghosts, clad head to toe in white camouflage overalls. A unique bond, the spirito di cordata, defined the Alpini. A cordata is the team of climbers roped together on a mountain where each man's life depends on the others. This spirit permeated their units. Small teams, roped together by trust and shared experience, would undertake perilous missions where a single mistake meant death for them all. Even food was a constant battle. Getting supplies to the highest positions was a logistical nightmare. Often the bread, wine, and meat would arrive frozen solid, requiring precious fuel to thaw. A hot meal was a rare and treasured luxury, a moment of warmth and civilization in a world of frozen barbarity. A letter from an Alpino lieutenant captures the surreal existence. From up here, the world is silent and beautiful. The peaks are like white gods. It is hard to believe there is a war. But then you see the black puff of an Austrian shell against the snow on the next ridge, and you remember the hell you are in. We live in a beautiful, terrible prison. The medics on this front were heroes of a special kind. Casualty evacuation was a nightmare. Stretcher bearers had to navigate treacherous, icy paths under fire. The wounded were often strapped into basket stretchers and lowered hundreds of feet down sheer cliff faces. The doctors in the aid stations fought not just wounds, but severe frostbite and the mysterious, deadly effects of high-altitude sickness. In this world between heaven and earth, faith played a crucial role. Military chaplains on both sides held services in chapels carved from snow and ice. They risked their lives to bring comfort to the men, becoming symbols of humanity in an inhuman environment. The image of a simple wooden cross against a backdrop of majestic, indifferent peaks defined the spiritual landscape of the White War. The silence was a presence in itself. After the thunder of an artillery barrage or an avalanche, a profound, unnerving quiet would settle over the mountains. It was a silence that amplified the sense of isolation, of being a tiny, insignificant speck in a vast, frozen wilderness. For many soldiers, the silence was more psychologically taxing than the noise of battle. Because the front lines were often so close, a strange and intimate form of warfare developed. Opposing trenches on a narrow ridge could be just a few dozen meters apart. The soldiers could hear each other's conversations, smell their cooking, and shout insults or even warnings across the chasm. They were intimate enemies. This intimacy sometimes led to unspoken truces. After a particularly massive avalanche, it was not uncommon for local commanders on both sides to observe an informal ceasefire. For a few hours, the war would stop as Austrians and Italians alike became simply mountain men, frantically digging into the tons of snow to rescue survivors, regardless of their uniform. The miners lived in their own special kind of hell. They spent their entire lives in the dark, damp, and claustrophobic confines of the tunnels. Their greatest fear was the sound of an enemy countermine approaching. They would press their ears to the rock, listening, always listening, for the faint sound of the enemy's pickaxes, knowing that the first to break through would win the subterranean fight. The operators of the cableways, the teleferisti, were the unsung heroes of the supply chain. Often civilian specialists, they worked in tiny wooden huts perched on the edge of cliffs, braving blizzards and direct artillery fire to keep the steel arteries of the army flowing. If the cableways stopped, the men on the peaks would die. The human engine extended down into the valleys. Here, the women of the region, the portatrici carniche, played a vital role. These incredibly strong women would carry loads of over 40 kilograms, ammunition, food, supplies, on their backs, climbing thousands of feet up the steep paths from the villages to the lower cableway stations, a crucial link in the logistical chain. What kept them fighting in such impossible conditions? For the Italians, it was the powerful force of irredentismo, the patriotic dream of liberating the Italian-speaking lands of Trentino and Trieste from Austrian rule. For the Austrians, it was a grim, dogged defense of their homeland and a deep loyalty to their ancient, crumbling empire. An assault on a high-altitude position was a slow-motion nightmare. The Alpini would climb for hours in the freezing darkness, their lungs burning in the thin air. The final rush was not a sprint, but a staggering, exhausted crawl over treacherous rock and ice into the face of machine guns in a desperate close-quarters struggle for a few square meters of frozen ground. Surviving an avalanche was a matter of pure, terrifying luck. A survivor described the experience. There was no sound, just a sudden pressure, a feeling of being pushed by a silent, immense force. Then darkness and an incredible weight. You do not know which way is up. You scream, but the snow swallows the sound. Then you pray for the digging to start. The insidious nature of frostbite was a constant terror. A soldier might remove a wet glove for just a few minutes to clear a rifle jam and find his fingers had turned white and waxy. The damage was often painless at first, the true horror only revealing itself later in the warmth of a dugout as the flesh turned black. Many men lost fingers, toes and noses without ever being touched by a bullet. To combat the crushing misery, the Alpini sang. Their beautiful, melancholic choral songs, born from the folk traditions of their valleys, would echo across the peaks. Singing was a way to affirm their humanity, to maintain their morale, and to honor their fallen comrades. It was an act of defiance against the silence of the mountains. The burden on the junior officers was immense. A young lieutenant was responsible for every aspect of his men's survival. He had to be a tactician, a mountaineer, a logistician, and a meteorologist. A single bad decision, a poorly timed patrol, a misread of the snow conditions, could result in the death of his entire platoon without a single shot being fired. The relationship between the vecchio, the grizzled veteran, and the boccia, the young rookie, was the core of the Alpini's institutional knowledge. The veteran taught the rookie not just how to fight, but how to survive, how to read the snow, where to find shelter, how to wrap your feet to prevent frostbite. This was knowledge that could not be learned from a book. Even animals were part of this human engine. The mules were the logistical heroes, but the army also used specially trained dogs. St. Bernards and other breeds were used to carry small amounts of supplies and, most importantly, to locate soldiers buried in avalanches, their keen sense of smell often meaning the difference between life and death. The psychological trauma of the White War was unique. It was not just the shell shock seen on other fronts. It was a trauma born of extreme isolation, of a constant grinding struggle against a hostile environment, and of the unique horror of subterranean and avalanche warfare. It left deep, invisible scars on the men who survived. Yet, amidst the horror, there were moments of profound, surreal beauty. A soldier, huddled in his frozen outpost, would witness a sunrise that set the entire Alpine range on fire with shades of pink and gold. For a fleeting moment, the war would disappear, and there would be only the majestic, inhuman beauty of the mountains. This contrast often led to a feeling of profound absurdity. An Alpino diary entry reads, "Today we spent 8 hours hauling a machine gun up a cliff face while the Austrians shot at us. All this for a piece of rock where not even a goat would choose to live. The world has gone mad." This sentiment was at the very heart of the soldiers' experience. The story of the White War is, above all, the story of human endurance pushed to its absolute physical and psychological limits. It was a war won not by brilliant maneuvers, but by the side whose soldiers could suffer the most, endure the most, and still find the will to climb a little higher and dig a little deeper. This was the unbelievable human engine that powered the war in the clouds. This was the courage and the misery that underpinned the grand strategies. But what did the men on the other side, the Austrian generals who had once mocked this effort, have to say? What was the final, cold admission from the very commanders who had been confronted with this new, terrible form of human resilience? In the early summer of 1915, the initial reports flowing into Konrad von Hötzendorf's headquarters were met with a sense of grim satisfaction. They spoke of minor Italian incursions into the high mountains, of small patrols of Alpini appearing on distant, insignificant peaks. To the Austro-Hungarian High Command, this was not an alarming development. It was proof of Italy's strategic incompetence. Conrad's focus was on the massive conventional battles he was anticipating along the Isonzo River. He saw the Alpini's high-altitude activities as a foolish sideshow, a waste of men and resources in a strategically irrelevant theater. He believed the Italians were playing right into his hands, ignoring the decisive front for romantic but pointless mountain climbing. The detonation of Col di Lana in April 1916 was the first brutal shock that shattered this complacency. The news that an entire heavily fortified mountain summit had simply vanished in a man-made eruption was incomprehensible. It was a tactical event so bizarre, so outside the known rules of warfare, that it was initially met with disbelief at the highest levels of command. An after-action report from an Austrian officer who witnessed the explosion captured the sense of profound shock. This is not war, as we know it. This is not chivalrous. The Italians are not fighting us. They are fighting the mountain itself. They have turned our greatest ally, the terrain, into a weapon against us. It is a new and terrible form of combat. The strategic response was immediate and frantic. A wave of new orders was issued to every high-altitude garrison along the 400-mile front. They were to cease focusing only on the enemy in front of them and start listening for the enemy below them. The war had fundamentally changed. Every Austrian soldier was now tasked with listening for the faint, terrifying sound of drilling. A grudging, professional respect began to grow between the opposing mountain troops. The Austrian Kaiserjäger were proud, elite soldiers, but they could not fail to be impressed by the skill, audacity, and sheer endurance of their Alpini counterparts. On the high peaks, the contempt of the generals in Vienna was replaced by the mutual respect of warriors sharing the same frozen hell. The Austrians were forced to adopt the same brutal tactics. Their artillery commanders began to issue reports on the successful use of shelling to trigger avalanches on Italian supply lines and barracks. This was a quiet, grim admission that they had been dragged into a new kind of environmental warfare where the mountain itself was the primary ammunition. A new kind of fear infected the Austrian troops. On the Western Front, soldiers feared the shell. In the Alps, they feared the mountain. They developed a specific dread of both the white death from above and the explosive earthquake from below. The constant anxiety of living on a mountain that could collapse or explode at any moment was a unique psychological torment. The Alpini's strategy of occupying the highest peaks created a logistical nightmare for the Austrians. For every Italian squad that climbed an inaccessible summit, the Austrians were forced to deploy an entire company to counter them, building new supply lines, cableways, and barracks. The Italians were forcing the Austrians to bleed precious resources in a war of attrition at 10,000 feet. Back home, the Austrian press romanticized the conflict, publishing heroic stories of the brave Kaiserjäger defending their Tyrolean homeland in a clean, noble war among the peaks. The terrible reality of the mine and avalanche warfare, the sheer grinding misery of it all, was carefully censored to maintain morale on the home front. High-ranking commanders were forced to admit the unique horror of this front. Archduke Eugen, the overall commander of the southwestern front, acknowledged in his dispatches that the war in the high Alps was unlike anything he had ever experienced. a costly, vertical stalemate that consumed his best troops with little strategic gain. The incredible Austrian city in the ice on the Marmolada Glacier was, in itself, a stunning admission of defeat. The only way the Austrians could find to protect their soldiers from the Italians' superior high-altitude artillery positions was to burrow into a glacier. You do not build a fortress inside a river of ice to defend against an enemy you hold in contempt. Even when the Austrians went on the offensive, the Alpini proved their worth. During the great 1916 Strafe expedition in the Trentino, Conrad's armies made huge gains in the valleys, but they were unable to dislodge the Alpini from their key high-altitude strongholds, which remained like thorns in the side of the Austrian advance. An Austrian intelligence officer's report on the interrogation of a captured Alpino corporal expressed astonishment. The prisoner describes climbing sheer rock faces at night under enemy fire as if it were a routine matter. He speaks of the cold and the avalanches with a fatalistic calm. They are not like regular soldiers. They seem to have a different relationship with fear and hardship. Austrian engineers began to study captured Italian mountain equipment with intense interest. They analyzed their portable artillery, their specialized climbing gear, and their innovative cableway designs. It was a grudging, technical admission that the incompetent Italians were, in this specific environment, masters of innovation. The initial Austrian arrogance had been based on a simple calculation. The mountains were on their side. They were now paying a heavy price for that assumption. The Alpini had not conquered the mountains. They had allied with them. They had turned the Austrians' greatest strength into a shared and terrible enemy. The personal rivalry between the commanders, Konrad von Hötzendorf and Luigi Cadorna, fueled the slaughter. Both men were stubborn, proud, and willing to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of their soldiers for meters of ground. The war in the mountains was a physical manifestation of their unbending and ultimately disastrous wills. An Austrian staff officer admitted in a letter home, "This is no longer a war for soldiers. It is a war for miners and engineers. The man with the better drill and the greater supply of dynamite has become more important than the man with the rifle. It is a strange and dishonorable way to fight." The greatest admission of all came not from men, but from nature. In the depths of winter, the war often ground to a halt. The blizzards and extreme cold became so severe that both sides were forced into a de facto truce. The informal ceasefires to rescue men from avalanches were a shared admission that the mountain was the true master of this front. A Kaiserjäger's diary entry from 1917 reads, "The Italians on the other ridge suffer as we do. We hear their songs, and they must hear ours. We fight and kill for a pile of frozen rock that is worthless. Sometimes I think the mountain is laughing at us all. This is not a war, it is madness." Ooh. The seemingly pointless but incredibly costly war in the Alps began to put a severe strain on the Austro-Hungarian home front. The stories of this strange, terrible conflict, leaking back from the front, were a blow to the morale of a multi-ethnic empire that was already beginning to fracture under the immense pressures of the war. Even during the great Austro-German victory of Caporetto in 1917, a battle that shattered the main Italian army in the valleys, the Alpini units in the high mountain sectors often held their ground, conducting disciplined fighting retreats that frustrated the enemy's attempts to completely encircle them. After the war, the memoirs of Austrian commanders were filled with reflections on the unexpected difficulty of the Italian front. They had expected a quick, punitive campaign against a weak enemy. Instead, they found themselves trapped for 3 years in a costly, grinding, and uniquely horrific war of attrition that they were unprepared to fight. The most eloquent, unspoken tribute to the Alpini's skill was the network of fortresses the Austrians built. The elaborate tunnels, the concrete bunkers, the city in the ice. These were not the actions of a confident army swatting aside a weak foe. These were the desperate, ingenious actions of a powerful army struggling to survive against a formidable and unpredictable enemy. The very language of the Austrian military communiques changed over time. The dismissive references to minor skirmishes in 1915 were replaced by grim acknowledgements of heavy fighting in the high mountain sectors and bitter struggles for individual peaks by 1917. The public narrative was forced to catch up with the bloody reality. This was the enemy's admission, written not always in words, but in their actions, their engineering, and their fear. A unique, grudging respect was born between the Alpini and the Kaiserjäger, a bond of shared experience in a hell of their own making, a respect that the generals in their warm headquarters could never truly understand. The ultimate strategic failure of the Austrians was this. Their plan was to let the Italians waste their strength in the Isonzo valleys. Instead, the Alpini dragged the Austrians up into the peaks, forcing them to fight a war they did not want, in a place they could not afford, bleeding their elite mountain troops dry and draining the resources of their fragile empire. The White War consumed a vast number of Austria-Hungary's best and most experienced Alpine troops. These were specialist soldiers who could not be easily replaced. Their loss on the Italian front weakened the Austro-Hungarian army's ability to fight effectively on other, more decisive fronts, like the struggle against Russia. The journey from the arrogant mockery of 1915 was complete. The Italian army, dismissed as a disorganized joke, had not beaten the Austrians in a conventional sense. But its elite mountain troops had trapped the proud Austro-Hungarian army in a form of warfare so costly, so brutal, and so utterly alien that it became a running sore that helped to bleed the entire empire to death. The Austrian generals, once so confident in their mountain fortress, had been forced to admit the terrifying reality of this new hell. They had been outclimbed, out-tunneled, and outlasted in a war they never imagined. But what would be the final outcome of this brutal vertical war? And what strange and lasting legacy would it leave upon the scarred mountains and the men who had fought there? Entendido. Gerando o bloco final do roteiro para concluir nossa história. Block 7. The lasting legacy. The guns on the Italian front fell silent in November 1918. But the echoes of the White War would reverberate through history. It was a conflict fought on the vertical fringes of the Great War, a sideshow in the grand strategic picture. Yet it remains one of the most extreme and singular testaments to human endurance and ingenuity in the annals of warfare. The most immediate and enduring legacy is carved into the very landscape of the Alps. Today, a century later, the mountains are an open-air museum. Hikers on the high trails can still find the ghostly remains of this conflict, rusting strands of barbed wire, collapsing wooden barracks, and the dark, silent mouths of tunnels that lead deep into the rock. The mountains themselves are the gravestone of the two armies that fought there. In a poignant and alarming modern epilogue, this legacy is melting. As the Alpine glaciers retreat due to climate change, they are giving up their century-old secrets. The bodies of Alpini and Kaiserjäger soldiers are emerging from the ice, perfectly preserved, along with their diaries, letters, and equipment. The mountain is slowly releasing its dead, offering a final frozen link to the past. The human cost of the Italian front was staggering. Over 600,000 Italian soldiers and nearly as many Austro-Hungarians lost their lives. On the White War front, the majority of these deaths were not from bullets, but from avalanches, frostbite, disease, and accidents. It was a war where the environment was the most effective killer. In Italy, the Alpini emerged from the war as national heroes. Their resilience, courage, and unique identity became a powerful symbol of Italian pride and sacrifice. To this day, the Alpini are one of the most beloved and respected institutions in Italy. Their annual national gathering, the Adunata Nazionale, drawing hundreds of thousands of people to celebrate their spirit and remember their fallen. For the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the war was a death sentence. The grinding, multi-front war of attrition, including the costly and draining stalemate on the Italian front, exacerbated the ethnic and political fractures within the fragile empire. In 1918, it simply disintegrated, vanishing from the map of Europe forever. Paradoxically, the brutal techniques developed for the White War had a lasting impact on the peaceful sport of mountaineering. The use of fixed ropes, steel pitons, and advanced climbing methods to conquer sheer rock faces under fire were later adopted and refined by civilian climbers, pushing the boundaries of alpinism in the post-war years. For Italy, victory in the war felt hollow. At the peace treaty, they were not granted all the territory they had been promised. This sense of a vittoria mutilata, a mutilated victory, created a deep well of national resentment and humiliation. This very sentiment would be expertly exploited by a rising politician named Benito Mussolini, fueling the rise of fascism. The White War serves as a timeless, tragic cautionary tale about the madness of nationalism. Here, men who shared a common Alpine culture, who looked alike, and who respected the same mountains, were forced by distant governments to kill each other for the sake of imperial pride and lines on a map. The most famous literary work to emerge from this front, Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms, captured its unique atmosphere of brutal combat set against a backdrop of breathtaking beauty. It cemented the Italian front in the world's imagination as a place of poignant, tragic, and often absurd horror. The physical scars on the landscape are permanent. The roads carved into cliffs, the foundations of the teleferiche, and the tunnels bored into the mountains are still there. The war literally reshaped the geography of the Dolomites, a lasting testament to the industrial power of two nations locked in a vertical death struggle. After the war, a remarkable thing happened. The once bitter enemies, the Italian Alpini and the Austrian Kaiserjäger, formed veteran associations that fostered a sense of friendship and reconciliation. They recognized that their shared experience of suffering in the mountains was a bond that transcended the hatred of war. History has not been kind to the two generals who presided over the slaughter, Cadorna and Conrad. They are remembered as prime examples of the stubborn, callous, and unimaginative generalship that characterized the worst aspects of the First World War. Men willing to sacrifice millions for their own rigid pride. The White War remains unique in the annals of military history. Never before and never since has a modern industrial war been fought on such a large scale, for so long, and at such extreme altitudes. It was, and remains, a singular event, a war fought on the very roof of the world. The mountains, in their own slow geological time, are reclaiming the battlefield. Wildflowers now grow in the collapsed trenches. Grass covers the shell craters. The mountains endured the folly of mankind and are slowly healing the scars. But the memory, frozen in the ice, remains. Modern archaeology in the Alps has become a race against time. As the ice melts, historians and archaeologists are recovering incredible artifacts. A love letter from a soldier, perfectly preserved in the ice. A diary with its ink still legible, a soldier's personal effects, telling the intimate story of a life cut short. The battlefields are now a place of remembrance. Museums have been built inside the actual wartime fortifications. Visitors can now walk through the cold, dark tunnels of mountains like La Gazoue, a chilling experience that brings the reality of the subterranean war to life. A long-distance hiking trail, the Sentiero della Pace, or Path of Peace, now winds its way for hundreds of kilometers along the former front line. It connects the forts, the trenches, and the cemeteries, turning a line of hatred and conflict into a journey of reflection and remembrance. The spirit of the Alpini lives on. The Alpini Corps remains an elite branch of the modern Italian army, specializing in mountain and Arctic warfare. Their identity, their songs, and their iconic feathered cap are a direct, living legacy of the men who fought and died in the White War. This story is a resurrection of a largely forgotten front of the Great War. The horror of the Western Front has long overshadowed the vertical hell of the Alps. But the war fought here was no less terrible, its soldiers no less brave, and its strategic importance far greater than is often remembered. If there is a moral to this story, it is that even in the most inhuman of environments, the most human of qualities persist. Courage, comradeship, resilience, and a dark sense of humor did not just survive in the frozen hell of the White War. In many ways, they thrived. The ultimate absurdity of the Mine War was its legacy. After blowing the top off a mountain like Col di Lana, the resulting crater often became another, even more formidable, defensive position, a jagged fortress of broken rock that was nearly impossible to assault. The solution had only created a new, more difficult problem. The final casualty numbers for the White Death are a chilling testament to the true nature of this front. On some sectors of the mountain front, it is estimated that for every 1 soldier killed by the enemy, 9 were killed by the mountain itself. The political legacy of the war was a bitter one. The new borders drawn in 1919 granted the region of South Tyrol to Italy, creating a large German-speaking minority within Italy's borders. This became a source of political and ethnic tension that would simmer for the rest of the 20th century. The end of the war did not bring a simple peace. The most profound admission of all was the unspoken one between the frontline soldiers. In their shared suffering, they recognized a common humanity in their enemy. The real enemy was not the man on the other ridge, but the cold, the ice, and the generals who had sent them there to die. The story of the White War is the story of men like Private Udelrico Fantelli. He died in 1916. His body was found, perfectly preserved, in a glacier in 2004. A letter to his fiancée was found in his pocket. He was finally laid to rest nearly a century after his death. He is the human face of this frozen conflict. The ultimate irony of the White War is that it was a conflict fought with incredible passion and sacrifice for territorial gain, for meters of ground. In the end, it did little more than permanently scar the very land both sides claimed to love, turning the beautiful Dolomites into a vast, high-altitude cemetery. The Austrian generals, who had laughed at the Italians' chances in 1915, had been proven tragically wrong. They were not defeated by a superior army in a conventional sense. They were defeated by an army that adapted to an impossible environment, dragging them into a hellish, vertical war of attrition that their empire could not sustain. The legacy of the White War leaves us with a haunting question. It was a conflict that pushed men to the absolute limits of what is humanly possible. What is the true measure of courage in a war where the greatest enemy is not another man, but the world itself? In the end, the empires are gone, the generals are dust, and the songs have grown faint, but the mountains remember. They hold the bodies and the stories of the men who fought in the clouds. And now, in their melting ice, they are finally speaking, telling the last frozen tales of the epic, tragic, and unforgettable White War.